There were 50 seconds left before Maya set the plates down, the way she always did, and before a man who owned everything discovered he could still be taken. The private dining hall glowed under chandeliers that glittered like cut ice, and the marble floor swallowed footsteps so completely it made the room feel staged, too clean, too controlled, too sure of itself. Maya moved through it, the way she'd learned to move through places that didn't see her, quiet, efficient, forgettable. Except her pulse refused to stay quiet tonight. It was the third time she caught the pattern under the table. Vivienne Blackwood's thumb, tapping the phone screen in short bursts, then pausing, then tapping again, all while her smile stayed flawless above the white linen. Maya's fingers tightened around a thin strip of receipt paper, creasing it until it nearly tore, the fragile little thing suddenly feeling like the only weapon she was allowed to carry. No, not this, not now. The air smelled of truffle butter and expensive cologne. Crystal chimed softly, and the violinist played as if music could smooth sharp edges into something harmless. Outside, rain hammered the curb and horns braided into impatient chaos, but inside, the warmth was sealed too tight, sweet in a way that turned sour in Maya's throat. Near the back corridor, a waiter she didn't recognize adjusted his cuff and flashed a staff keycard with a motion so practiced it barely looked like a motion at all. Small, precise, poisonous, a snake in silk. Vivienne didn't even lift her eyes when she typed. She didn't need to. And when a manager appeared at Ethan's side with a courteous tilt of the head, the invitation toward the hallway didn't feel like service. It felt like a door closing gently before anyone noticed. Ethan rose the way power rises, calm, inevitable, as if he were carved out of marble even when he moved. Maya's own rule, learned in kitchens and narrow streets, slammed into her chest. Thinking takes time, and time kills. The note weighed almost nothing in her palm, yet her whole body leaned toward him, as if gravity itself had shifted. Down. 7 steps from the corridor, the manager repeated the beckoning finger again and again, like a metronome counting an ending, and Maya moved, steam and dish soap and rain in her lungs, shoulder colliding with Ethan's side as she turned him away from the open doorway, her body covering his, just as silverware screamed across stone and the room snapped its head toward the sound. And time fell to 12. Ethan kept his face perfectly still as the note burned against his palm, a scrap of paper that somehow shifted the whole room without moving a single chair. The chandeliers didn't dim, the violin didn't miss a note, and Vivienne's smile stayed, calm and beautiful across the white linen, yet the air felt thinner, like the restaurant had quietly sealed its doors. He folded the paper once, twice, as if neatness could tame meaning, then slid it into his pocket with the same care he used to sign deals that ruined men. When he lifted his glass, the crystal touched his lips like ice, and he swallowed something he couldn't taste. He forced warmth into his voice, laughed at the right beat, and nodded as if the word family could be repaired with etiquette. The room smelled of truffle butter and polished wood, and the marble floor reflected candlelight so cleanly it looked like a second, colder world beneath their feet. Vivienne spoke of their parents in soft phrases that made grief sound refined, almost manageable, and Ethan answered with measured sentences that revealed nothing. His heartbeat tried to climb his throat, but he pushed it down, deeper, into that place where control lived, and fear had to ask permission. Every second he stayed seated felt like choosing to breathe through a narrowing straw. His gaze began to move the way it always did when danger stopped being theoretical, quietly, completely, without mercy. A waiter he didn't recognize hovered near the back corridor, hands too still, eyes too attentive, posture trying to look harmless and failing by a hair. The security guard by the entrance shifted, and Ethan caught the clean glint of an earpiece under the collar, the kind that didn't belong to a man paid to smile at guests. Under the table, Vivienne's phone flashed again. and the pale glow painted her knuckles with a private fire. In that small light, Ethan understood something ugly and simple. The trap wasn't waiting outside the building. It was already breathing in the room with him. He slid his chair back a single inch, testing the sound, measuring the attention, watching for any twitch from his sister that would admit she was listening for escape. Nothing changed, and that was the worst part, because danger this close always wore a calm face and spoke in gentle tones. He thought of Maya's eyes when she'd slipped him the warning, the way she'd looked through the luxury and still chosen to be brave, and something inside him tightened into a quiet resolve. If he stood too fast, the room would turn. If he stayed too long, the door would close. If he chose wrong, the first person punished would be the one who had tried to save him. So he smiled again, let the lie of normality settle over the table like a fresh layer of linen, and planned his next move like a prayer he wasn't sure he deserved. Ethan kept talking as if his voice could hold the room together, but his mind had already slipped sideways into memory, searching for a time when Vivienne's calm meant safety. He saw their mother's hands smoothing a tablecloth at home, the way she treated simple things with reverence, and their father standing by the window, steady as a post in a storm. Grief had made everything sharp, and control had been Ethan's only anesthesia since the funeral. Tonight, that anesthesia was wearing off, and every polished surface seemed to reflect a stranger. He remembered Vivienne when they were younger, older sister, perfect posture, the one who carried the adult tone before either of them was grown. She used to fix problems before he could name them, and he used to mistake that for love because it felt like relief. At the cemetery, she'd held his elbow as the dirt fell, her voice low, her eyes dry, promising they would handle everything the way the Blackwoods always did. He had believed her because belief was easier than imagining emptiness. Now he wondered if he'd been trained, gently to confuse guidance with a leash. Across the linen, Vivienne mentioned their father's legacy again, and the word legacy landed like something heavy wrapped in velvet. Ethan's fingers brushed the funeral program, still folded in his jacket pocket, the paper soft at the edges from being opened and closed too many times, as if he could read his parents back into existence. He watched Vivienne's mouth shape sympathy, watched her phone glow under the table like a quiet pulse, and felt an old resentment underneath her elegance. Something patient, something fed for years. The room's warmth turned claustrophobic, and his grief began to rearrange itself into suspicion. Then his eyes caught a detail that didn't belong. At a nearby table, a man lifted a glass, and on his hand was a signet ring Ethan knew too well, his father's distinctive crest, the one that was supposed to be locked away, the one that should have been buried with everything else. Ethan's throat tightened, and the restaurant's gentle sounds suddenly seemed staged, like the hush before a verdict. He held his smile in place because it was the only armor he had left. And while Vivienne kept speaking softly, Ethan stared at that ring and felt the past open like a door that shouldn't exist. Ethan let the memory snap shut and returned to the table with a smile that felt borrowed, a mask he'd worn in boardrooms and courtrooms and now, somehow, at his own family's grief. Vivienne's voice stayed gentle, her words arranged like flowers, pretty, intentional, meant to distract from what was rotting underneath. He watched the man with the signet ring again, watched how easily he moved in this room, as if he belonged to Ethan's past. The ring flashed once in the chandelier light and vanished into a folded napkin, and Ethan felt his stomach drop with a certainty he couldn't name out loud. He excused himself with perfect manners, pushing his chair back just enough to seem casual, as if he only needed air or a moment to steady himself. The marble floor took his footsteps and gave nothing back, and that silence made every glance in the room feel louder. In the corridor, the lighting turned colder, the kind that made skin look pale and honest, and Ethan saw the manager again, now speaking too quietly into an earpiece, shoulders angled to block the line of sight to the back exit. A valet at the side door checked his watch. Once, twice, like he was timing a delivery. Vivienne's text arrived while Ethan's phone was still in his hand. "Don't disappear, Ethan. Tonight is about family." The message looked warm on the screen, but the words felt like a hand closing around his wrist. His signal flickered for a breath and steadied again, enough to show one more notification, an unknown number calling and disconnecting in the same second, as if testing whether he was still reachable. Ethan's pulse stayed controlled, but his thoughts sharpened into angles. Doors, cameras, staff positions, the distance between him and the dining room, the distance between him and the truth. Back inside, Maya's movement caught his eye. Small, deliberate, almost nothing. Yet it changed the hallway's flow like a stone dropped into water. She stepped into the staff path just long enough to redirect a co-worker, just long enough to keep someone from slipping behind him, just long enough to buy him seconds that suddenly felt priceless. Ethan didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but he recognized the look in her posture, the look of someone who had seen danger before and learned how to move around it without being seen. And as he turned back toward the table, he understood something colder than betrayal. Vivienne wasn't improvising tonight. She was executing. Ethan returned to the table with the same calm he wore to acquisitions and funerals, a softness placed carefully over something sharp. Vivienne looked up as if she'd never doubted he would come back, her expression a practiced blend of concern and composure, the kind that made other people relax. He sat, adjusted his cuff, and let his eyes flick once to her phone hand under the linen. When he spoke, his voice sounded gentle, almost grateful, and that was the first lie he used for survival. He asked her small questions that sounded like comfort, how she was sleeping, whether she'd eaten if the house felt too quiet, while he listened for what slipped between the words. Vivienne answered flawlessly, too smooth, as if she'd rehearsed the cadence of grief in front of a mirror. She mentioned security in passing, the family lawyer, the burden of responsibility, and each phrase landed with the weight of a suggestion Ethan hadn't requested. He nodded at the right times, and inside him something bruised, because the sister he remembered would have stumbled at least once if she were telling the truth. Maya moved through the room again, her presence barely registered by the wealthy, but Ethan noticed her because she carried tension like a second uniform. She approached another table, then, without warning, let a tray tip just enough to send a fork skittering across porcelain. The sound cracked through the polished calm, bright and rude, and several heads turned at once, drawn to the mistake like moths to a flame. Ethan caught Vivienne's reaction in that instant. Her smile tightened, only for a heartbeat, and her eyes darted, quick, calculating, toward the back corridor. When the room settled again, Vivienne's phone glowed under the table as her thumb resumed its quiet rhythm. Tap-tap, pause, tap, like a heartbeat that wasn't hers. Ethan felt the first real wound open. Not fear, not yet, but something worse. The slow, sick realization that betrayal could wear the same face that once brought him soup when he was sick. He kept his posture relaxed, kept his hands steady, kept the conversation warm, because any sudden movement would be a match to dry grass. And while Vivienne spoke in tender tones about healing, Ethan watched the light from her screen flicker across her knuckles and wondered, with a cold clarity, if he had ever truly known her at all. Ethan's pride rose first, fast and hot, because running felt like admitting he could be cornered in a place where money usually kept him untouchable. He kept his shoulders loose, his breathing even, and let the old habit of control do its work, even while something inside him wanted to stand up and break the scene apart. Vivienne watched him with that same calm patience, as if she already knew what he would choose. The room stayed beautiful, Candlelight, crystal, velvet, yet Ethan could feel the beauty tightening around him like a fitted glove. He tried the most reasonable escape first, a quiet glance toward the restaurant's security, the kind of subtle signal powerful men didn't have to explain. The guard met his eyes for half a second, then looked away too quickly, as if acknowledging Ethan would require permission he didn't have. Ethan's stomach dropped with a new understanding. Tonight, the uniform wasn't loyal to the building, or to him, or even to law. It was loyal to a plan. And plans, he knew, didn't care who you were once you were inside them. Maya appeared near the edge of his vision, hovering by the service station as if she were waiting for a table to need refills. But her posture was wrong for waiting. Too alert, too ready, like someone bracing for impact. Ethan saw Vivienne's eyes flick to her, just once, and in that flicker there was irritation, then something sharper, the way a person looks at a stain on an expensive shirt. Maya wasn't supposed to exist in Vivienne's world, and yet she had dared to touch it. That made her dangerous. Ethan realized, with a quiet kind of horror, that escaping alone would be easy compared to escaping without sacrificing the one person who had warned him. He could throw money at a door and make it open, but money wouldn't protect Maya when the room decided she was the problem. His mind began to calculate new angles, routes that kept her out of sight, exits that didn't spotlight her, moves that looked like accidents instead of accusations. He lifted his glass again, smiled again, and let the performance continue. Because the moment he broke character, the trap would snap, and he promised himself one thing in the space behind his teeth. If he had to choose between his pride and her safety, pride would lose. The plan accelerated before dessert, as if someone had decided the room had waited long enough. A smiling staff member approached Ethan with practiced warmth and a low voice, mentioning a private call from the family lawyer, something urgent, something that couldn't be taken at the table. Vivienne didn't react, not with surprise, not with concern, only with a small nod that looked like permission. Ethan rose because refusal would be a flare, and he hated how easily his body obeyed the choreography. The hallway felt colder than the dining room, the light turning everyone's skin a little too pale, a little too honest. The manager walked half a step ahead, guiding him with gentle pressure that never quite touched, while another figure drifted behind, close enough to be an accident. Ethan's phone showed one bar, then none, and the silence of that dead signal hit him harder than the threat itself. He thought of Maya, of the way her warning had been small and trembling and absolute, and he realized the trap had been built to make him feel alone. Maya tried to move from her station the moment Ethan stood, but a supervisor intercepted her with a polite hand on her arm that wasn't polite at all. "Not your business," the man murmured, smiling at her like she was a child reaching toward a hot stove. Maya's eyes flashed, fear, anger, resolve, before she forced her face back into neutrality because she understood what they would do if she made noise. Across the hall, Vivienne remained seated, her posture calm, her expression softened into something that could pass as sadness, as if she were watching a necessary procedure. The door to the private room opened with quiet efficiency, and Ethan stepped inside to keep the scene from exploding in the corridor. The air changed the moment the door shut, too still, too controlled, like the room had been waiting for him. The lock turned with a soft, final sound, and Ethan felt his name, his money, his reputation become useless in the space between four walls. From the other side of the door, Vivienne's voice carried through, low and certain, like a verdict delivered without emotion. "Do it now." Inside the private room, Ethan stood still for one breath, letting the silence show him what the noise had hidden. The walls were dressed in dark wood and soft gold trim, the kind of wealth meant to soothe, but it felt like padding in a coffin. He touched his phone again. No signal, no way out with a simple call, and the small failure made his pulse finally break its perfect rhythm. In the dining room he could pretend. In here, pretending had nowhere to sit. He listened, hard. A faint shuffle beyond the door. A quiet cough that didn't belong to nervousness. The air smelled faintly of citrus cleaner beneath the richer scents, and it reminded him of hospitals, of endings dressed as order. He closed his eyes for half a second and saw his father's hands again, steady on Ethan's shoulder when he was a boy, teaching him that character wasn't what you said when people watched, it was what you chose when nobody would. Ethan's throat tightened, not from fear alone, but from the shock of grief turning into a test. The lock clicked again, just a test, just a reminder. And Ethan's mind raced through options that all carried a cost. Fight and trigger whatever waited outside. Plead and give Vivienne the satisfaction of control. Wait and trust timing he could no longer see. His gaze landed on a small service panel near the baseboard, barely visible, the kind of detail meant for staff, not guests, and he wondered how many exits existed in a room designed to contain a man. Then he thought of Maya, and a colder truth settled. This wasn't only about saving himself anymore. Outside in the corridor, Maya moved with a calm she didn't feel, her hands steady while her stomach twisted. She found the staff keycards where they always hung, behind a half-closed service door, and slipped one free like stealing a breath. Her job, her safety, her future, she could feel all of it balancing on that thin piece of plastic. And as Ethan stood in the airless room, listening to footsteps gather on the other side, he understood that the only path out might demand a sacrifice he wasn't willing to take, until the door handle started to turn, slowly, like someone savoring time. Maya returned to the corridor, with her face arranged into the same neutral mask she wore for difficult customers, even though her hands were shaking under the tray. The stolen keycard pressed against her palm like a heartbeat that didn't belong to her, slick with sweat, fragile in the way a single mistake becomes permanent. She kept her steps measured, letting the carpet swallow any urgency, letting the chandelier spill gentle light over her like a blessing she didn't deserve. Every second felt borrowed. At the private room door, she bent as if to straighten a fallen napkin, and slipped the keycard into the seam beneath the frame, pushing it forward with 2 fingers. "Kitchen," she breathed, barely sound at all, the word riding the edge of the violin's distant notes. Inside, Ethan caught the card with a quiet precision that startled him, his own hands still capable, still steady, even as his chest tightened. The plastic felt warm from her skin. It felt like trust. He swiped once, twice, and the lock surrendered with a soft click that didn't belong in a moment this loud. Ethan waited for footsteps to shift, for breath to change, for the room outside to look away by accident, and then he opened the door the width of a book and slipped through as if he were sliding out of his own life. The corridor smelled of citrus cleaner and expensive perfume, a cruel blend, and the light made everything look too clean to be true. Maya didn't look at him for long. Looking too long would be a confession, but she moved first, guiding him with the smallest tilt of her head toward the service door. The kitchen hit them like weather. Steam, bread, dish soap, heat, life in motion, loud and real, nothing polished enough to hide behind. A heavy-set dishwasher with tired eyes glanced up, read the panic in Maya's posture, and turned his body as if by habit, blocking a narrow sightline with a stack of pans. "Hey!" he called toward a nearby guard with false annoyance, pointing at a puddle by the sink. "That leaks back again." The guard stepped closer, distracted by the ordinary problem, and Ethan and Maya slipped past the swinging door and into the rain-slick night, the city swallowing them whole, while the storm blurred the world into streaks of light and danger. The rain didn't hide them. It only changed the shape of the world, turning streetlights into smeared gold and every shadow into a question. Ethan's dress shoes slipped once on the wet curb, and the humiliation of it burned sharper than the cold, because he wasn't supposed to be a man who ran. Maya kept close, guiding him between parked cars and puddles, her breath coming fast, her apron soaked and heavy against her legs. Behind them, the restaurant's warm glow looked unreal, like a lie he'd almost believed. His driver should have been waiting where he always waited, the black sedan positioned like a promise at the edge of the curb. Instead, there was another car, darker, cleaner, too still, parked as if it had been placed there on purpose, its windshield reflecting nothing but rain and patience. Ethan felt a chill travel up his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. Vivienne hadn't only planned his dinner, she'd planned his instincts, his roots, even the way grief would make him predictable. Power, he realized, wasn't protection when someone knew exactly how to use it against you. Maya tugged his sleeve and shook her head once, sharp and final, then turned him away from the curb before he could make the mistake of walking into that waiting mouth. She led him down a side street where the pavement cracked and the shops went dark, where traffic noise faded into a distant, angry hum. A small church appeared through the rain, old brick, simple doors, a single lamp burning above the entrance like someone had refused to let the night win. Ethan hesitated only a second, because stepping inside something humble felt like stepping out of his world entirely. The air in the church smelled like wax and wet stone, and the warmth was different from the restaurants, less sweet, more honest, as if it didn't need to impress anyone. An older pastor looked up from a worn desk and didn't ask who Ethan was, didn't ask what he could give, only watched Maya's shaking hands and Ethan's too-controlled face and opened a door to a back room. Ethan's phone stayed dead, but the pastor's old device buzzed once on the desk, the screen lighting the dim space with a single line of text that made Ethan's blood turn to ice. They were asking for him by name. Ethan stared at the pastor's phone as the rain kept ticking against the stained glass, steady and impatient, like the night was counting down for him. The message on the screen was short and clinical, and it used his full name the way contracts did. Precise, ownership-like, final. The church smelled of wax and wet stone, warm in a humble way that should have soothed him, yet his ribs felt too tight for air. Maya stood a few feet away, soaked and silent, her hands clasped as if she were holding herself together. Ethan forced his voice into calm, because panic always charged interest. He asked the pastor for a private corner and dialed the family lawyer from the old device before anyone else could. The line crackled, and the lawyer answered too quickly, like he'd been waiting with the phone in his hand and guilt in his throat. Ethan didn't accuse. He didn't need to. He simply said he wanted the truth now, not tomorrow, not after another funeral, not after another polite lie. There was a pause, heavy with calculation, and then the lawyer's tone changed into something resigned. "There's a clause," the man admitted, "and it activates if you're removed from control." The words settled in Ethan's stomach like ice, because removed didn't sound like paperwork tonight. It sounded like a plan with hands. The lawyer spoke of a sealed account, a hidden trust, and an addendum his parents never filed publicly, something written to exist in shadows. Vivienne's name appeared again and again, not as a simple heir, but as an executor in waiting, as if she'd been promised the keys the moment Ethan slipped. Ethan felt grief twist into anger so clean it almost steadied him, because anger at least had edges he could hold. He looked at Maya and understood her warning wasn't only brave, it had been terrifyingly accurate. Then the lawyer said a name that didn't belong in Ethan's world, and Maya's posture tightened like a pulled wire. "Reyes," the man repeated, careful, as if saying it too clearly might crack the past open. Maya's eyes flicked to Ethan's face, and he saw a fear there that wasn't about being fired or blamed, it was about being connected. The lawyer kept talking, voice low, about an old scandal, a quiet payment, A night Ethan's parents made a decision to protect the family. Ethan's thoughts narrowed into one brutal question. What exactly had they buried, and why did Maya's blood suddenly matter? The pastor returned and slid a sealed envelope across the desk, wax-stamped, the ink on the front, deliberate. For Ethan only. Ethan's fingers hovered because he'd spent his whole life believing paper was power, and now paper felt like a weapon aimed at his identity. He broke the seal and unfolded the contents with a carefulness that felt like prayer, the church holding its breath with him. A photograph slipped out, glossy, aged, its edges worn as if it had been hidden and handled 1,000 times. Ethan stared at the faces in that picture, and something inside him tore open in absolute silence. Ethan didn't sleep, not really, not with that photograph living behind his eyes like a second set of memories. The church's back room was quiet, but his mind kept replaying small details from the night his parents died, now poisoned by the thought that they'd also been hiding something long before. Maya sat on a wooden chair with her hands wrapped around a paper cup of tea she hadn't tasted, shoulders tense like she expected blame to fall from the ceiling. The pastor spoke softly about patience and protection, but Ethan heard only the lawyer's words echoing in his bones. When dawn finally thinned the darkness, Ethan made a choice that felt like swallowing glass. He called the lawyer again, this time with rules instead of questions. He demanded a full copy of the addendum, a list of every person with access to the trust, and the timestamps tied to any activation clause, facts that couldn't be smiled away. The lawyer resisted for half a breath, then surrendered, and Ethan heard fear in it, not of Ethan, but of what Vivienne would do if she learned he was still moving. Ethan asked one more thing: where Vivienne would feel safest. The answer arrived without hesitation, as if it had always been the destination. The house, the lawyer said quietly. She'll go to the mansion. They drove there in the pastor's old car, humble and anonymous, the opposite of Ethan's usual procession. Rainwater clung to the roads, and the city looked scrubbed and tired, like it had spent all night watching and pretending not to. Maya stared out the window, jaw tight, and Ethan caught the way her eyes kept returning to her hands, as if she were afraid they'd reveal her secrets without permission. He wanted to tell her she was safe, but he didn't trust promises anymore, not even his own. The mansion rose at the end of a private drive like a monument to control, stone and iron and perfectly trimmed hedges that had never known hunger. Vivienne met them in the foyer as if she'd been expecting guests, not consequences. Her hair was immaculate, her dress understated and expensive, her face softened into concern so convincing it would have fooled anyone who hadn't seen the trap close. She took one look at Maya, and her gaze cooled, the tiniest shift, like frost forming on glass. "Ethan," she said, voice low and affectionate, "you disappeared. I was worried." Ethan heard the lie the way he heard a false number in a ledger, clean, confident, and designed to pass. He didn't raise his voice because raising it would give her the satisfaction of spectacle. He held up the sealed documents and the photograph, letting the evidence sit between them like a blade on velvet. The pastor remained behind him, steady and silent, a witness Vivienne hadn't planned for, and Maya stayed close enough that Ethan could feel her trembling like a warning bell. Vivienne's smile didn't vanish. It simply sharpened. "You're making this dramatic," she murmured, stepping closer as if to soothe him, as if to guide him again. And as her diamond caught the morning light and shattered it into cold shards across the marble floor, Vivienne whispered the sentence that turned Ethan's blood to ice. "Because you're not the one they meant to leave it to." For a moment, the mansion felt too quiet for the sentence Vivienne had just laid down, as if the house itself had to decide whether to believe it. Ethan didn't flinch, but he felt something inside him shift, grief sliding aside to make room for a colder clarity, the kind that didn't beg anymore. The photograph sat in his hand like a second heartbeat, proving that the story he'd lived in had missing pages. Maya stood close enough to hear his breathing change, and she braced without being told because she understood that power rarely surrendered politely. Across the marble, Vivienne's composure held, perfect, gleaming, yet her eyes watched Ethan the way a gambler watches the last card. Ethan spoke softly, the way his father used to speak when he wanted truth more than obedience. He asked Vivienne to repeat herself, not for drama, but for record, and the pastor's steady presence turned the foyer into something like a courtroom without a judge. Vivienne smiled, as if she were indulging a child, and described her betrayal as correction, as balance, as what should have happened long ago. She said Ethan was too sentimental, too gentle, too willing to be saved by strangers, and the words stung, because they were aimed at the exact place he'd tried to keep human. Ethan listened until she finished, then held up the documents and asked one question that made her jaw tighten. If you're so certain you're right, why did you need a trap? Vivienne's eyes flicked toward the corridor, quick and sharp, and Ethan followed the glance like a thread. A man stepped from the shadow near the study entrance, dressed in expensive neutrality, hands empty, but posture armed, moving with the calm of someone who believed permission had already been granted. Maya's stomach dropped. She recognized him from the restaurant. The same stillness, the same patience, the same quiet certainty. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. He made a small motion with two fingers, curling inward, a hook in human form, and the air in the foyer tightened like wire. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He shifted half a step so his body covered Maya's line, not because she needed protection like a child, but because he understood exactly how scapegoats were chosen. "Leave," he said to the man, calm as stone, and the man smiled like he'd heard that word before and buried it. The pastor lifted his phone and spoke one sentence into it, measured, clear, naming names, naming location, naming threat, and in that instant, Vivienne's confidence faltered for the first time. Not fear of Ethan, fear of witnesses. The man in the corridor hesitated, only a breath, because plans hated light, and the pastor's call was light. Ethan used the breath. He stepped forward, forcing the distance to collapse, pushing the documents into Vivienne's view, like a mirror she couldn't turn away from, and said, "You wanted the truth hidden. It's not hidden anymore." Vivienne's smile strained, her hand tightening around her phone, as if she could text control back into existence. Maya's eyes met Ethan's, wide and steady, and she understood he'd made his choice. And as the house held its breath, the first crack appeared in Vivienne's perfect mask, thin as ice, loud as thunder. The truth didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived with paperwork, a recorded call, and the slow collapse of a plan that depended on silence. In the mansion foyer, Vivienne stood perfectly still, while the pastor repeated names and details into the phone, turning whispers into something that could be checked. Ethan watched her face as the seconds passed, waiting for outrage, for tears, for a performance, yet what showed through first was exhaustion, a flicker of something old and hungry. The man in the corridor retreated a half step, not defeated, just recalculating, like a predator deciding the meal wasn't worth the noise. Ethan felt the room loosen its grip by degrees, and he hated how familiar that sensation was. Vivienne's voice dropped, losing its polished warmth, and she spoke as if she were finally tired of acting. She blamed their parents, blamed the choices made in private, blamed being the one who carried everything, while Ethan inherited the softer love. Her words came sharp, then shaky, then sharp again, a rhythm of resentment that had been rehearsed for years in the dark. Ethan didn't interrupt. He let her reveal the true wound, not money, not legacy, but the belief that she had been overlooked on purpose, denied on purpose, replaced in spirit long before she was replaced in ink. When she finally fell silent, Her composure cracked, and for the first time she looked less like an enemy and more like a person who had mistaken control for survival. Ethan's anger didn't vanish, but it changed shape. He told her there would be consequences, legal ones, public ones, and he didn't soften that truth, because kindness without boundaries was just another kind of lie. Yet he refused to strip her humanity away, refused to turn her into a monster he could hate without guilt, because he could still hear their mother's voice in his head, insisting that cruelty never healed anything. He offered a path that sounded almost unbearable in its simplicity: accountability, therapy, time, and the long work of rebuilding without blaming ghosts. Vivienne stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language, as if mercy insulted her more than punishment. Ethan held his ground anyway. Maya remained near the edge of the room, small against the mansion's stone and glass, feeling the weight of every chandelier as if it could fall on her. She expected someone to turn and point at her, to call her a liar, a troublemaker, the perfect excuse for why the night had gone wrong. Instead, Ethan turned toward her with an expression she didn't know how to read. Gratitude, yes, but also something steadier, something that asked her to stop disappearing. She shook her head once, already preparing to quit, already preparing to vanish back into a life where bravery was punished quietly. "I did what I had to," she murmured, as if that sentence could protect her from what came next. Her hands were still trembling, and she hated that anyone could see it. Ethan stepped closer, careful not to crowd her, and spoke to her the way he wished someone had spoken to him in that restaurant, plain, firm, real. He offered her work, not as charity, but as respect, a place in his world where her courage wouldn't be treated like an accident, where invisible wouldn't be the price of survival. Maya's throat tightened because offers from powerful men usually came with strings, and she had spent her whole life learning to spot them. But Ethan's eyes didn't bargain. They acknowledged. And just as she began to believe the night might finally be ending, her phone buzzed with an unknown number, one call that made her blood run cold, because the voice on the other end knew her father's name and said it like a key turning in a lock. Months later, the cemetery air felt different, still cold, still honest, but no longer sharp enough to cut Ethan every time he breathed. He stood before his parents' headstone with a small bouquet in hand, the stems damp from morning fog, and he didn't rush the silence the way he used to. The photograph and the documents had changed the shape of his grief, turning it from a closed room into a long road. He learned that legacy wasn't only what was left behind, it was what you refused to repeat. And for the first time since the funeral, his shoulders looked less like armor and more like a man. Vivienne's consequences arrived the way consequences always did. Slow at first, then all at once. Meetings, attorneys, restraining orders written in careful language that still hurt. But the healing began in quieter places, where there were no chandeliers to hide behind and no power to barter with. She entered therapy the way she once entered boardrooms, determined to win, and discovered there was nothing to win except herself. On certain days, she volunteered under a different name, serving meals and stacking boxes, hands trembling as if humility had weight. She never became soft overnight, but she began to become real, and that was its own kind of mercy. Ethan didn't forgive her quickly. He forgave her correctly, through boundaries, truth, and time. Maya didn't vanish the way she planned to. She tried at first, keeping her head down, refusing attention, treating bravery like a one-time mistake. But Ethan's world had shifted, and he wouldn't let her courage be erased as inconvenience. She took the job he offered on her own terms, watching contracts carefully, asking hard questions, learning the language of rooms that once pretended she wasn't there. Some days, she still wore an apron at the Foundation's events, not because she had to, but because it reminded her where she came from and what she survived. She carried a small heart-shaped charm in her pocket now, a quiet, private symbol of the night she chose action over fear. And when she looked at Ethan, she no longer saw an untouchable man. She saw someone learning how to be human on purpose. Together they built something that couldn't be kidnapped, trapped, or signed away. Ethan created a foundation in his parents' name, not to polish his image, but to bring their hidden kindness into daylight: college funds, emergency rent support, legal help for workers who were treated as disposable. He made rules that weren't about control, but about protection: transparency, accountability, no deals in shadows. The first time he stood at a podium, he didn't speak like a billionaire. He spoke like a son who finally understood what his parents had tried to do, even when they did it imperfectly. And when the audience applauded, he looked back at Maya, because he knew none of it would exist without a note written in trembling hands. On the last day of the year, Ethan returned to the restaurant, not to relive the trap, but to rewrite the meaning of that place in his mind. The marble was still glossy, the chandeliers still bright, the air still rich with butter and perfume, but the room felt smaller now, less powerful. He sat at a simple table with Maya and the pastor, and for the first time he ate without scanning exits every few seconds. When midnight neared, Maya unfolded a clean receipt and wrote a single line, not a warning this time, but a promise. "You're not alone anymore." Ethan read it, smiled in a way that reached his eyes, and let the year close without fear. If this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption. And a happy new year to everyone wherever you are.